Agenda item 14 is presentation by Hardy Consulting Group, Senator Warren Hardy, retired, regarding the 2013 77th regular Nevada legislative session, possible direction from City Council. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Warren Hardy with the Hardy Consulting Group. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I apologize for being unshaven, but I am in open rebellion against the system until after Scout Camp. So just glad to be home for that legislative session. First of all, I want to indicate that we reviewed, with the help of your staff, we reviewed over 200 pieces of legislation this session for the impact that they would have on Mesquite. And I want to particularly point out the efforts of Joy Eastwood and Cindy Mesquite in helping us do that, as well as all the folks down the chain that reviewed and got back to us. And when we needed comments quickly, we got comments quickly. And so I do want to recognize that. What I have tonight is not a very comprehensive report for you. I'm preparing a fairly comprehensive document for the council as well as the staff to look at in terms of the bills that pass that will impact the city. And then I hope to come up and have an opportunity to answer questions about what all that legislation does and what the expectation is for the city. However, the governor has still got bills that he is considering. We don't know what he's going to veto and what he's not going to veto. And so it was impossible to make that comprehensive list available tonight, so I apologize for not having a handout for the council. But I hope to have a very comprehensive report to you the 1st of July. First, I'll just, and so I'm just going to sort of hit the highlights from this session. And some of the bills you might have heard about in the media and at a high level that might impact the city. And also some of the bills that failed to pass that I think are probably in most cases good for the city that they failed to pass. But first I want to talk about the two that we sponsored and went forward with as a city that Assemblyman Hardy introduced on our behalf. The first was Assembly Bill 131, which was the Virgin Valley Water District charter change to provide for the election of all members of that board. That legislation passed both houses and has already been signed by the governor. Then the other bill that we personally introduced and moved forward with was Assembly Bill 382 with regard to the funding for the Habitat Conservation Plan. That legislation also passed both houses and has already been signed by the governor. So it's now clear that as we move forward with the Habitat Conservation Plan that we're working on, that there was two issues really that needed to be resolved. First of all, whether or not any local entity besides Clark County could retain that money. As we got into the drafting of the bill, there became an additional question about whether or not, even if we allowed other local governments, whether or not the city of Mesquite could retain the money. So between the Assembly and the Senate, we had to get an additional amendment to make it clear that the city could retain that for its own habitat study, and we were able to do that. The third issue that got a little complicated towards the end was there was a desire by the county and some of the other local entities to increase the threshold limit. Currently the law allows a maximum of $550 per acre. There was a proposal to amend the legislation to allow any reasonable amount. We tried to be accommodating of the county, but as we had our discussions internally, we felt at this point it was best to leave that cap at 550. If there's a need for the county or anyone else to go forward in future sessions to seek an increase, they can do that. But in this legislation that we passed, it remained at 550, the maximum that can be charged per acre. Incidentally, on that note, I missed a couple of the meetings, at least two of the meetings during the legislative session with Fish and Wildlife and SNWA and the county on the habitat plan. And I want to publicly thank and recognize the work of John Willis and Richard Seacrest for staying on top of that issue. Those discussions are well down the road. I think are moving towards a very satisfactory conclusion for the city, and I just want to recognize their efforts. I'll be attending those meetings going forward, but thanks to them for continuing those discussions. So just some of the highlights, some of the bills that passed. The Assembly Bill 68, which was the new C-tax distribution formula. That legislation passed relatively early in the session. There was a companion a portion to that bill that dealt with sort of the leveling out of the population. That did not pass. That got caught up in some misunderstandings late in the session. That was not a bill we had control over. In retrospect, I would have gone back and tried to have more control personally over that bill. But that was a bill that legislative leadership had committed to pass, that we were told, and I want to give some credit to Assemblyman Hardy, who helped me consistently remind legislative leadership that that bill was out there. And at the end, it got caught up in the shutdown of the session. And so we are in the midst of trying to determine what the impact is and where we go from here on that. But that was, I think, the low light of the session for me, that that portion didn't pass. But the new C-tax distribution formula did, which by all accounts is going to be very favorable to the city. Another bill that I think the staff will be happy to hear about is Assembly Bill 172. Most people that deal in public works are familiar with the Assembly Bill 144 from the last session, to the 2011 session, which was the Nevada First legislation, which provided a series of requirements before anybody could get the local government bidder's preference. And that legislation proved to be very difficult for local government and public works departments to stay on top of. AB 172 was a bill that cleaned up a lot of those issues, and I think will be very helpful moving forward. Assembly Bill 283, I don't know how much construction manager at risk work the city does, but that is a public procurement process that most local governments are moving towards pretty rapidly. And it's something that the legislature has grappled with for going on 10 years. In fact, I introduced the first piece of legislation to allow CMAR, construction manager at risk, and we've gone back each session to try to resolve it. This session, the procurement process was in a little bit of danger because some of the construction industry doesn't like the way it translates into a procurement process, but we were able to say that there are going to be some continuing discussions about how that procurement can best be used, and we'll be participating in that in the interim. The fuel indexing tax, some of you are familiar with the necessity to index the taxes in Clark County because Southern Nevada has been at a significant disadvantage in getting matching federal funds for road construction projects because Washoe County voters approved the indexing of the fuel tax a few years ago, and so they have plenty of money on hand to match federal funds, and Clark County has been missing out. This was a top priority of the RTC and most of the local governments, and this one passed in a very frenzied. I think there were 6 minutes left in the session when the final action was made by the legislature to get that one through, but it did pass. There are some projects for the city of Mesquite on that priority list. Another bill that passed that I think was quite important to us was the More Cops tax, and I want to recognize Chief Tanner for the countless hours of work he did on helping with the More Cops. That was Assembly Bill 496, and that was one of the more interesting stories of the session. As we were standing around a Monday night waiting to conclude the session, the Assembly realized with about 6 minutes, and for those in the audience who may not be aware, Nevada has a 120-day constitutional limit. The session must end at midnight on the 120th day. At 6 minutes to midnight, the Assembly realized they had not appointed a conference committee to work out the differences. Senator David Parks of Las Vegas had proposed an amendment in the Senate to sunset each year the More Cops tax, so the legislature would have to go back and approve it. That's not something we supported. We didn't like that amendment, but he proposed it nevertheless. And at the very last minute, when it was realized that they had not even assigned the committee yet, the Senate made an effort to reconsider their action, whereby they disagreed, or whereby they proposed it and rescind from their amendment. And it was too late. We ran out of time. So as the clock struck 12, the More Cops tax died. As we were running around frantically, I was able to get with the Republican leadership in the Senate and help them understand that that had died. And we were able to get the governor to call a special session. That's the primary reason the governor called the special session, was to pass the More Cops tax. That will be, according to Chief Tanner, that was his top priority this session, will be immensely helpful. They did not approve the full quarter-cent tax, but they did approve a 0.15 tax, which will be very helpful. And I also want to recognize, in addition to Chief Tanner, the efforts of the Metropolitan Police Department. We were part of their lobbying effort and helped them push that through. So that was one of our top priorities of the session. Another bill, interestingly enough, that I should mention, just because it's of interest to me personally, since I also did the first piece of legislation on behalf of the city of Mesquite on off-road vehicles, ATVs on the road. We did pass finally comprehensive legislation to allow the registration of vehicles, but it gives a lot of control to the entities, the local government entities, on how to deal with that. And the other bill that I probably received more calls from council members and others on was Senate Bill 362, which was a bill proposed by Senator Spearman to have minimum nursing staffing, and that was apparently going to be very problematic for the hospital here. We succeeded in getting an exemption or amendment to provide that the provisions of that do not apply to rural hospitals such as the city of Mesquite. So that's kind of a highlight of the ones that did pass.